Welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Your chance to learn about the teachings of the Catholic Church on sacred music, both in theory and practice. Through interviews, discussions, and music, your hearts and minds will be lifted up and better understand what it means to sing the praise of His glory. And now, your hosts, Peter Carter and Dr. Jennifer Donaldson.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. We're joined today by a repeat guest who's out with a new book. Listeners may know of the work of Dr. Kerry McCarthy, herself a student of our guest from 2 weeks ago, Dr. William Mart, and author of a book about William Byrd. She joins us today to discuss her new book on Thomas Tallis, specifically focusing on the liturgical changes of Reformation-era England that Tallis lived through. If you are interested, like Dr. McCarthy, in studying with Dr. William Mart or studying the history of sacred music more intensively, I'd like to draw your attention in a particular way to two classes that we're offering this summer at St. Joseph's Seminary. Dr. Mart will be teaching an advanced seminar in Gregorian chant from July 19th to 23rd through St. Joseph's Seminary, and he'll focus especially on the analysis of chant that's at the heart of the profound understanding he offers listeners, readers, and students when approaching the meaning of Gregorian chant. Also, I'll be teaching Principles of Sacred Music. It's online at your own pace week by week from June 1st to July 25th. And then we meet synchronously to discuss more recent history and contemporary church legislation on July 26th and 27th. It's an intensive survey of the history of sacred music in the Roman Rite, and it's a class that I've seen be such a huge eye-opener for students in laying the foundations for a real ability to think with the church about music, and thinking with the church as she's been through so many issues and changes throughout history. We just recently released a video about the summer program that's available on the Square Notes Facebook page, and it has interviews with some students from last summer. I'd encourage you to check it out. And you can also download our brochure, which has tons of information about the affordable tuition rates, etc., on the website of St. Joseph's Seminary, dunwoodie.edu, and Dunwoodie is spelled D-U-N-W-O-O-D-I-E. Click on Dunwoodie Music, or you can also access that by going to our website for the podcast, sacredmusicpodcast.com. Click on Upcoming Events. And now, on to our interview with Dr. Kerry McCarthy. Thanks so much for joining me again today on the show, Kerry.
Thanks for having me. It's really a pleasure to be back.
So last time you were with us, we talked about William Byrd and the experience of Catholics in Tudor England. And on this episode, I'd like to focus on the changes in liturgy that took place under the reign of Henry VIII and subsequent monarchs, all through the lens of Thomas Tallis, Byrd's older colleague and the subject of your most recent book. In the first few chapters of your book, you talk about Tallis's work at Dover Abbey and then at Waltham. And of course, Waltham was the last monastery to be dissolved by Henry VIII. And in discussing Tallis's work at those abbeys, you note that much of the music program at monasteries centered around the Lady Mass. Could you explain to us more about the Lady Mass? Is it just a fixed Marian votive Mass? And why was it so popular with the laity? And what music would there have been for it?
The Lady Mass is a special Mass in honor of the Virgin Mary that normally takes place quite early in the morning. And it's called a votive Mass because unlike the normal Mass of the day, which is in honor of whatever saint's day it is, whatever season of the year it is, it's offered specifically in honor of Our Lady. It's a votive offering, the same way a votive candle is offered in front of a particular shrine, is this sort of freely given thing that people do as a devotion. So the Lady Mass is a usually early morning Mass, specifically in honor of the Virgin Mary. And whatever else is going on that day, still the Lady Mass could be and was celebrated in the great cathedrals like Salisbury Cathedral, for example. They had a Lady Mass sung every single day of the year except Good Friday and Holy Saturday. Those were the only 2 days that there's something even more serious going on. We just have to make room for that. And one reason why, in fact, I think the main reason why the Lady Mass was so popular with lay people, with ordinary folks, is that it was the early morning Mass and you could go to it before you went to work. Whether you had a white-collar job in a city or whether you were a farmer who went out to plow the fields, this was the morning Mass for working people. Now, the Mass of the day, the High Mass, so to speak, that was usually sung sort of mid-morning. If you look at the liturgical books, it's after the hour of terce, after the third hour. So that would be 9 a.m. and usually was sung around 9 or perhaps 10. The High Mass could go on for a long time, a lot of very complicated music and ceremony. And at that point, it's eaten up almost half your day. For example, when Tallis was first with the Chapel Royal before the Reformation, they got their lunch after the High Mass of the day. By then, you're getting on to 11 o'clock. You're already eating your midday meal. So for working folks, this Lady Mass would have been something much more convenient. It fits into a more normal family schedule for people whose first job is not the liturgy. And the other reason why these Lady Masses were so popular among lay folks is that in monasteries, they were celebrated outside the enclosure. In a monastery, lay people can't just go into the monk's choir or the nun's choir and walk around and kneel down and talk and so forth. It's very strictly enclosed. It's not an area that outsiders are supposed to come into. It's reserved for the community. But the Lady Masses for example, at these monasteries where Tallis was working as a lay musician, they took place in a separate space, in the Lady Chapel, which was dedicated to the Virgin Mary, which was outside the enclosure, and people were free to come in. In fact, a lot of people chose to go to these abbeys instead of to their parish churches because there were these beautiful places and the music was so good. And there were these special chapels that gradually almost became set aside for lay people for these morning devotions. So you go there, you have this beautiful experience, and then you go off to work.
Was it a fixed repertoire and fixed texts, or did it depend on the season?
It did depend on the season. The basic ceremony was always the same, but you had, just like with the normal proper of the Mass, you have certain seasonal changes. In fact, some of you who are listening have actually been to a Lady Mass, even if you don't necessarily know it. Some parishes in December during Advent, they have what are called the Rorate Masses, the introit there being Rorate Celi, and it's named after the introit. And those are celebrated very early in the morning, which in December means they're by candlelight. It's still dark out. And they're votive masses of Our Lady with the special texts for Advent. That's the Lady Mass. That 6 a.m. or 7 a.m. Mass with the special Advent texts for the Virgin Mary. That normally we just get it at my own church on Saturdays in Advent. That would have been sung certainly every Saturday of the year, and in lots of churches every single day, all through the week. So there were different pieces of music for the different seasons. And we know that Tallis wrote music for the Lady Mass. We know he composed some pieces. And it's frustrating because all we have left are fragments. I'm thinking of two pieces in particular. Every day during the week, there was a different Alleluia that you sang at the Lady Mass, just to keep things interesting. And the only one we have from Tallis is the one for Tuesdays. So only one day out of the week. And it's obvious that this is a fragment of something bigger. It's obvious that he would have written a cycle of these for the whole week, and that this one little manuscript has this one poor little scrap that's just one day out of the week for Tuesday. And again, there's a sequence, a very beautiful sequence, Ave Preclara Maris Stella, Hail Radiant Star of the Sea, that was sung at Lady Masses. And sequences, if you've sung one, on Easter, for example, the sequence is Victimae Paschali. These things have lots of verses. And all we have from Tallis for this Lady Mass sequence is one verse. One verse, again, a fragment of something that was obviously much bigger, that almost survived by chance. And that's really a situation we have a lot with Tallis's music, is what survives are just a few pieces of something that we know was a lot bigger. We have, imagine it as a jigsaw puzzle. we might have 5 or 10 little pieces, but you can tell from the diversity of the pieces, the size, the shape. This was a 1,000-piece puzzle, but we've got these 5 or 10 little scraps, and we have to somehow extrapolate from them, and especially with the Lady Mass, because unlike some other things in the pre-Reformation liturgy, these just stopped. The moment the Book of Common Prayer came in, the moment the worship was put into English, the Lady Mass was over. There was no place for this. None of the music continued. And so what we have, especially from Tallis himself, are just these tiny little fragments that show us how big this tradition must have been. The fact that you can get somebody like this great composer like Tallis to compose these special pieces that were only sung once a week. The Alleluia for a Tuesday, and you get to use it once a week, and then you put it back in the box. But he was working on this sort of detailed level, and I'm just sad we don't have the other 6.
Yes, yeah. So, since there are so few documents, as you mentioned, that remain about Tallis, I mean, even aside from these musical fragments, just the very few fragments that we have documenting his, existence on payrolls and all these other sorts of things, you talk about the challenge of documenting his life and narrating it. And one of these challenges is even Tallis's life in the Chapel Royal, from which it seems that no records remain, neither music lists nor eyewitness accounts of what was sung and played. So what can be surmised about what Tallis's musical life looked like in his early days in the Chapel Royal of Henry VIII?
So as you say, when Tallis joined the chapel, Henry VIII was still king. He was getting old and grumpy, but he was still there. And when Tallis first started making music for the chapel, things were really still quite conservative. Everything was still being sung in Latin. They were still celebrating the Mass. Of course, the Church of England had broken from the Pope, had sort of declared administrative independence, so to speak. But the rituals were still pretty conservative. Henry himself liked that. He was quite old-fashioned in his musical tastes, in his ritual tastes. As long as things didn't have to do with the Pope, you couldn't mention the Pope, as long as you didn't mention saints that he didn't like. He did not like Thomas Becket, for example, too much political baggage.
Indeed.
So he was right out. But really, not that much had yet changed when Tallis came in. And just about when Tallis joined, in the early mid-1540s, you start to have the first liturgical changes. You start to get things in English, for example, very, very slowly. And in fact, the first thing that the Chapel Royal sang in English wasn't even sung inside the church. It was sung outside the church for processions. And this was a litany in English. So the idea was to have an elaborate procession. You walked around outside, around the boundaries of the church, sometimes even the boundaries of the parish, which is quite a long walk. And you had these prayers, these sort of bidding prayers in English. And it's interesting, when you look at the actual document for this litany, when it was first published, it's not just a piece of music. It also comes with a kind of set of instructions. It says, now this is supposed to be sung very clearly so people can understand the words. The people who are attending or walking in the procession are supposed to listen to it. Don't talk, don't say your own private prayers. If you have a book and you can read, you can follow along. Otherwise, listen intently. And the singers are supposed to be sure they're pronouncing it clearly. So what we have here is this idea that becomes really important in the English Reformation, and really in the Reformation in general, that liturgical music is supposed to be something didactic. You're supposed to be teaching the people something. You're not just creating an atmosphere that's conducive to prayer. You're not just creating something beautiful. In a way, it's not even about the ritual, although obviously the litany has all kinds of prayers, and you're praying for peace, and at this point you're praying for the Pope to be destroyed and all these things. But the main idea is to educate people, to let them hear Scripture and let them know what they're supposed to be praying about, and so as many as possible can understand it. They have it in English. Now, of course, as soon as they break the seal on this, they have the first thing sung in English. Then English starts to come inside normal church services as well. You have the first churches starting to do Compline in English. You have a law still under Henry VIII that you're supposed to have English Bible readings at every service. So at this point, it's still Mass in Latin, and the singers are still singing chant and polyphonic music in Latin. But during or after that, you're supposed to have a chapter from the Bible read in English. So every time the people show up to church, they need to be taught something. It's not enough just for them to be there and praying in community. There has to be a little lesson as well.
Right. So circling back to these litanies, when Catholics think of litanies, obviously we think of things like the Litany of Loretto or the Litany of the Sacred Heart, and things that are very, that expand from the tradition and not necessarily always scriptural tradition, that they're filled with texts that are not, maybe they have scriptural allusions in them, but are kind of an enrichment of the faith that comes through tradition and not specifically through scripture. So I'm wondering, in these texts of the litanies that are introduced under Henry VIII, what sorts of prayers are you saying? Are they entirely Christocentric, no reference to the saints? What do these texts look like?
Absolutely. This is not the Litany of the Saints. In fact, in some ways, it's the Litany of the Saints with all the saints taken out. So what you still have all the various prayers and requests for peace, for good weather, for political harmony, for protection from illness, protection from disaster, the illumination of the Holy Spirit, all these things. But the invocations of the saints have been taken out, which is normally the first part of that traditional litany. For a while, at the very, very beginning, they were still invoking the Virgin Mary. There was still a line for her, and there was still a line for all the saints in general, as a kind of compromise to the more traditional parties. And then eventually that went away as well.
Right. And what was the music like? I mean, was it completely chanted, or were there polyphonic responses? How did that work?
There were two different versions of it at the time, and one of them was just plain chant. It was just chanted and had chanted responses. And then there was a version in 5 parts, so still quite simple harmony, but in 5 parts sung by a choir. And that was actually composed by Tallis. So the first piece of polyphonic music, the first piece of music in parts that we know was sung in English in the Chapel Royal, was composed by Tallis, and it was clearly a commission for this occasion because no one had ever written anything like this before. Tallis was right there at the center of power. He was there in the chapel where they were pioneering this stuff, and he obviously was asked to write it. And in fact, his litany, these 5-part choral responses, those are still sung in the Church of England sometimes. It's an elegant little setting. It still works. It's still very clear. You can understand all the words. And it's, in fact, one of the very, very, very few pieces of music, church music, in the English church that have really been sung, I think, without interruption since it was composed in the 16th century. In the English Civil War in the 17th century, there were a few years when the choirs were just shut down. But other than that, Tallis's litany has always been sung. It's a piece of continuity that goes back to these first days of the Reformation.
Interesting. So, of course, things changed much more dramatically under Edward VI. I'm wondering if you can explain what the changes were under his reign meant for the structure and language of the liturgies. Of course, that's a complex subject, but how would that have affected Tallis's work at that time?
Well, the most obvious change is that everything was in English. Almost immediately, everything was taken out of Latin, put into English. And before long, you had the Book of Common Prayer, which means that everything was in English and it was standardized. You had a single book that was published. This was the liturgical book for the whole country. Now that you have a national church, it's all nationalized. And every single parish, every single cathedral had a copy of this book and was expected to sing exactly what was in it and nothing else. Now, the "and nothing else" part is important because this got rid of all of these votive observances, things like the votive masses, the lady masses, various extra things that the singers would sing, various devotions, which were really the bread and butter of a lot of these composers. All of a sudden, you could not sing it unless it was in the Book of Common Prayer. And what was in the Book of Common Prayer was, in some ways, just a translated and adapted version of the Latin liturgy. In some cases, really beautifully translated. You know, Cranmer, who worked on these translations, had a really beautiful sense of language. And in fact, the ceremonies now of the Anglican Ordinariate use a bunch of these translations, and they fit well into Catholic ceremonies because they come from the same place. But it was also a lot more restricted. For example, in the old services, you had the Mass of the day, you had also the Lady Mass in most places, and then you had the Divine Office, or what we now call the Liturgy of the Hours, and there were 8 different services that were part of that. You had matins, late at night, early in the morning, depending on where you were, and then you had 7 other services all through the day. And this is something, especially at a cathedral or a monastery, that was really a full-time job for the musicians. Now, in the Book of Common Prayer, that gets reduced to 2 services. You have matins, now that's the morning service, and then you have the famous Anglican service, which is evensong, which is the evening service, kind of a hybrid of the old Vespers and the old Compline. But all of a sudden, there's a lot less for the singers to do. And for example, when Tallis was older, there's a rule made in the Chapel Royal that the musicians have to be there on certain days for both services. So most days you don't even have the Eucharist. You only have that on Sundays. Most days you just have matins and evensong, both services.
Wow.
And you think about what a shift that is.
Yeah.
One practical thing is that a lot of church musicians had to start moonlighting in different jobs. Some of them started pubs, took up brewing. This is always a nice thing to do. A lot of them wound up tutoring children, teaching in private households or running schools, because you got a lot less hours. Being a church musician went from a full-time job to a part-time job because the number of services and just the complexity of the music was cut down overnight.
Right.
Must have been a real shock.
Yeah. But the number of personnel wasn't reduced, right? It was just that they were working fewer hours.
Exactly. That's an interesting thing about the Royal Chapel and the cathedrals. They didn't immediately cut down on the number of people. Some of the cathedrals did get rid of, or some of the churches did get rid of their choir schools for boys. Part of that was there just wasn't as much for the boys to do. And part of that was a certain puritanical strain of thought that said, well, why should we take boys during their most impressionable years, from age 7 or so to age 14, and have them singing all day when we could have them studying scripture and learning to be good, godly Protestants? And there was this sort of real puritanical backlash against music education. So some of the choir schools just didn't survive that. But certainly the grown-up singers, the professional singers, the choirs were just as big. There were just as many people, but they just had so much less to do.
Right. So, of course, we go from those drastic changes to another extreme in the changes of liturgical life in England under Mary Tudor and the restoration of Catholic liturgical life. And could you talk a bit perhaps about that? And you mentioned, for example, in your book, the connection of the famous musicians, Antonio de Cabezon and Philippe de Monte to the court at that time.
Yes, so now we're into the 1550s, and Tallis is middle-aged. He's getting older, getting comfortable. He's well established in the Chapel Royal. And King Edward VI has died. He was young. He was never in good health. He never even made it to 18, so he had sort of bureaucrats and ministers and stuff running the government for him and imposing all of this very extreme Protestant stuff. And he dies, and then Henry VIII's next child takes over, Queen Mary. And there were a lot of people who did not want to have a woman running the country, but she was next in line in the succession, so she was queen. And she was Catholic, very, very, very convinced Catholic. And the first thing that she did was to repeal all the old laws that said things had to be in English, bring all the old services back, pass some very, very strict regulations against heresy. In fact, Queen Mary is notorious for burning a lot of people at the stake.
Yes.
She did not compromise on this stuff. But what that meant for musicians was that everything basically overnight went back to how it had been 20 years before. Unlike the Reformation changes that happened gradually to some extent, there were a few jolts along the way, but a lot of it was relatively gradual. This was almost an overnight change back to how it had been. And this must have been difficult in a practical sense. First of all, they'd gotten rid of a lot of the books. There had been laws just 5 or 10 years before saying if you have music in Latin, if you have service books, chant books in Latin, either turn them in or burn them. We don't want you having this stuff in your church. And then the next day, guess what? You have to sing all the services in Latin again, and you've been obedient and turned in your books and burned your copies, and now you have to start from scratch. So just the amount of cultural whiplash that must have been going on is really amazing. But people, where they could, they revived old music. There was quite an industry of printing chant books, of also copying music by hand, basically just trying to get everything back up to scratch as soon as possible. And there were also a lot of positive things that happened in music during those years. It wasn't just panic and people trying to rebuild from scratch. One good thing about Queen Mary, when she wasn't out burning heretics, she was very interested in culture, literature, and music, and especially Spanish culture. She married King Philip of Spain. This was quite the dynastic choice there, to have the Queen of England marry the King of Spain, and they could create this big Catholic empire together. And instead of Mary going to Spain, Philip came to England, and he lived with her there. They decided to have the dynasty based in England. So what that meant is Philip brought his musicians with him, and he had this grand Renaissance court with all these composers and all these performers, and they came along with him. So you have people like the organist Cabezon, who you mentioned, who was an amazing improviser. He was blind, by the way, like quite a few blind people wind up going into music and keyboard playing as a career.
Yeah, interesting.
And he was a brilliant improviser. He wrote variations. And clearly, this was a kind of organ playing that no one had really heard in English churches before. In fact, this is right about when Tallis's keyboard music starts getting really fascinating. And again, you have the composer Philippe de Monte, who had a long career all over Europe, but at this point he was still young. He was working for the Spanish Habsburgs. And he wound up becoming friends with William Byrd, who was very young at this point, still a teenager. But he wound up corresponding later in life with Byrd. And in fact, we have a couple of motets that Monte and Byrd sent to each other a couple decades later. So they clearly stayed in touch. Byrd was influenced by his style. And you had these international connections, partly because you have a Spanish king there with hundreds of Spanish people, but also because England was part of an international church again, which of course came with its own problems, but they opened up the windows a little bit and new culture was coming in again. And of course, if you can only sing in English, that rules out all of the repertoire from other countries. But as soon as you're allowed to sing in Latin again, people can bring music from Spain, they can bring music from France, they can bring music from Italy, and the choir can sing it because it's in this sort of universal language.
Right. So the latter part of Tallis's life is, of course, under the reign of Elizabeth I. And what role did Latin play in compositions during her reign? You talked with us when you were on the show last time about the kind of studied art pieces that were composed in Latin as a sort of entertainment. But what was Tallis's experience of that under Elizabeth I?
We really don't have any evidence that people were singing in Latin in churches. Now, officially, you were allowed to if you could guarantee that everyone in the congregation would understand. So, in college chapels, for example, was the obvious case. But we don't have any reports of this actually happening. Certainly not in the royal chapels where Tallis and Byrd were. And the music that we have by Tallis in Latin, some of it seems to be from later in his life. With Tallis, it's a little bit difficult to set exact dates to things because, unlike Byrd, he didn't always publish. He wasn't as interested in getting his own stuff into print. He wasn't quite as ambitious. So you don't have these books with dates, years and months on them, and dedications with specific circumstances. But the music that Tallis wrote in Latin when he was older, it really seems to have been for private use. This kind of stuff wasn't used in church. It wasn't encouraged in church. It would have caused serious political problems to sing it in church, especially in the Chapel Royal, where Tallis was so heavily involved.
You talk also during this period a bit about the brush with a more Calvinist approach to music, where they would have done away with basically all non-scriptural texts and the banning of organs. So can you tell us a little bit more about that aspect of things in the mid-16th century?
Yes, there was a lot of debate in the English church, even after Queen Elizabeth came in, and starting in the 1560s, England is officially Protestant. That never really changes back again. But there still was a lot of debate about what direction the church should go in. At the one extreme, you had a lot of English clergy who said we should basically be a national Catholic church, but just without the Pope. Everything should be completely traditional. We shouldn't have this political tie to Rome. On the other extreme, you have very severe Puritans, what we might call low church people, who think we should have a sort of Calvinist setup the way they do in Geneva. Very little singing, nothing but unaccompanied psalms, if that, and very, very strict. And what was going on starting in the 1560s is the bishops and other officials, but really mostly the bishops, had to hash this out among themselves. They had these meetings, what were called convocations, really the equivalent of a sort of synod or a council, where they'd all get together, argue about this stuff. None of them agreed. There were these extremes. There was a whole continuum in between of high church, low church, various political allegiances. And there's one particular occasion that I mentioned in the book because this really jumped out at me, was in 1563, when they decided to vote on church music in particular. And one of the statements was that the use of organs and curious singing should be removed. And curious singing, of course, meaning fancy singing, complicated singing. So this particular vote was taken by the English bishops in 1563, and the measure lost by one vote. So 57 of the English bishops said, get rid of organ music, get rid of choirs, and 58 of them said, no, that's not such a good idea. We should not take it this far.
It's so interesting, too, to think about that in connection with the proximity to the Council of Trent and these same sorts of discussions happening in the Catholic Church.
Absolutely.
So you talk in your book about the challenge, again, of documenting Tallis's life, and you mention Tallis's will as an important artifact, that his wife, Joan, was the executor of the will, and that two men from the Chapel Royal were the overseers of his will, one of them being, of course, William Byrd. But going a bit further out in Tallis's circles, you mention in your book another associate from the Chapel Royal, Richard Bower, who was in charge of the choristers. And it's interesting that Bower names William Roper as an overseer of his will. And perhaps our listeners will recognize that name as the son-in-law of St. Thomas More. And it seems that Roper and his family were avid supporters of musicians. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. If anyone here has seen A Man for All Seasons, they'll recognize the name William Roper, the son-in-law of Thomas More, as you say. And the Roper family, as you say, were huge patrons of music. In fact, William Roper's own son, Anthony, gets mentioned by the Tallis family. Tallis's wife, Joan, says in her will that Anthony Roper had shown good favors to my late husband and me. Now, good favors, usually in this kind of context, it means either gifts of money or some kind of social help, helping through some difficult political or social situation. So the Roper family was very directly and personally involved with the Tallis family, with the composer and with his larger extended family. William Roper was well known as this music patron. In fact, the Guild of Professional Singers in London, the sort of trade union for church musicians, had a portrait of him, had a portrait of William Roper hanging in their guild hall. And he was known as a supporter of the group, especially as you got further into the 16th century and more of them started getting into financial difficulties because there just wasn't as much work to do. So Roper supported musicians. The other group that Roper liked to support were people in prison. And of course, his father-in-law had been a famous prisoner. But we see here a lot of Catholics in the later 16th century wound up in prison for various lengths of time for their beliefs and for their political actions. And Roper was helping them out as well. And in fact, there were some people who were musicians and wound up in prison or wound up in other difficult circumstances. Byrd himself was under house arrest for a while. And the Roper family were supporting these people. So there was a really, really tight link between that family and between the professional musical community.
Right. So another link that you make is this letter from a Mr. Sujum coming from across the English Channel to Byrd with a request for music. And this letter gives evidence of exactly what you're talking about, this connection of a sort of circle of recusant sympathizers and Catholics with Byrd and Tallis in the Chapel Royal. Could you tell us a little bit more about this particular letter and its implications?
This is a really funny document because in a way, it leaves us with more questions than it answers. This is a letter written in 1580. So Tallis was already quite elderly by then. Tallis died in 1585. And so he was probably in his 70s at this point. We don't know quite when he was born. But this letter was sent to Byrd, so to Tallis's student. It was almost certainly sent from Europe, was sent from across the English Channel. And the only reason we even have this little letter is because it was picked up as part of basically an espionage or counter-espionage project. People were trying to pick up on secret messages being sent back and forth by Catholics across the English Channel, and this got nabbed as part of that, which is why we have it. So this particular letter, that the fellow who wrote it signs himself Richard Sujum, or Sugum. I don't even know how it's pronounced because that's not a normal English name.
Yeah, it's such a weird spelling.
There is nobody in 16th century England who was named that. I should look in the London phone book to see if there's anybody named Sujum. And people have said, oh, maybe it's an anagram, not of anything that I can think of. I guess it's an anagram of Meshuggah. That doesn't work, though. But this is obviously some kind of pen name, some kind of nom de plume, right? It's a pseudonym. And he's very, very cagey with what he wants from William Byrd. He says he would like certain songs, certain pieces of music. He doesn't say what these certain songs are. He says he wants to make an introduction of a certain friend to Byrd. He doesn't say who the person is. He wants to give Byrd some information, but he doesn't say what the information is. He says, many things which perhaps you will like well to know. So it's all very secretive, which is not normal for a 16th century letter. If you look at correspondence in the Renaissance, people go into all kinds of details. They just talk and talk and talk and give you all kinds of trivia. But here, clearly this guy has something to hide. and there's something kind of going on under the table. But the interesting thing then, he says at the end of the letter, "Well, Mr. Bird, would you please say hello to all my friends and colleagues? I pray you remember me to Mr. Tallis, Mr. Blythman, Mr. Mundy, all of these folks from the Chapel Royal." And Tallis is the very first person he names. Now, maybe he just names him first because by this point, Tallis was the most famous person in the Chapel Royal. He was the senior member, he was the most distinguished, and it would be polite to greet him first. But the fact that this fellow, this Sujum fellow, is sending this extremely risky and kind of cagey letter about clearly secret communications, and then by the end, just at the end, just comes out and says, "Oh, and please say hello to old Mr. Tallis and all his Chapel Royal colleagues." So here we have someone who's clearly an insider, who knows these guys, who knows all these professional musicians who are working for the Queen, and is also involved with what I can only assume is espionage, passing on these secret messages. And it's crazy to see Tallis named in the middle of this. It doesn't really tell me anything about Tallis's own beliefs, but he was clearly part of this circle, and the writer is not shy about naming him. He won't give any other details, but he'll say hello to Mr. Tallis.
Right.
Crazy.
So to wrap up a little bit and kind of putting a bow on this Catholic aspect of Tallis's life and work, I'd like to go back in time to the beginning of Tallis's career. And I'm wondering if you could share with our listeners a bit about the Sarum Antiphonale of 1519 to 1520 that you describe in your book as a core of Tallis's early professional experience as a musician. What was so special about that particular book as it was produced? And what are some of the interesting differences in the Sarum rite from the Roman rite that are evidenced in the text and music of this book?
That's a great question. So when I started writing about Tallis, I knew that I wanted to write about lots of musical documents, lots of manuscripts, lots of printed books with Tallis's music in them. But I decided that I would start with a book that's not by Tallis at all. I decided I'd start with a book that Tallis would have known when he was young. That probably would have been one of the first books he sang out of as a young professional musician. And this is, as you said, the Antiphonale, the large book of chant for the divine office. And this particular version of the Antiphonale was printed in 2 volumes. And the first volume was printed in 1519, and the second volume was printed in 1520. So from what we know of Tallis's approximate birth date, he would have been in his early teens, probably. So just getting into his serious training as a singer and as a composer. And these chant books were really designed to replace what had been tens of thousands of handwritten copies that had been circulating in England all through the 14th and 15th centuries. The idea was to have a uniform book that everybody could sing off of it and they'd all be singing the same melody. In some ways, it's a bit like what the monks of Salem were doing in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The editors of this Antiphonale in 1519, they went back to the original sources. They had a bunch of academics working on it. They had a bunch of paleographers who could really go back and get good versions of the music that everybody could sing together off the same copy. And so huge numbers of this book were printed. The book itself was actually printed in Paris. It was so large and complicated that basically no English printing press could deal with it. So it's a huge book, 2 volumes, and it has all of the chant for the whole divine office, the whole Liturgy of the Hours for the whole year. So spectacular book. It's really beautifully printed as well. They're large copies, so they're designed for 2 or 3 people to sing from together. In fact, there's a wonderful document from right around this time from a church in England where someone's complaining that he's sharing a book with another singer, and that singer won't let him see the book. The other singer is standing in front of it, is hogging the book, and would somebody please tell him to let his colleague get in, get in and see the music. And if any of us who've sung or played off a shared copy, we know exactly what that's like. But this Antiphonale was a large book. It was designed to be shared. And it's printed with red staff lines and black notation, and the words and the notes are very clear. And even in my book, even before I started writing about Tallis's music, I spent a whole chapter just kind of walking the readers through this chant book. I started at the beginning of Advent, which is the beginning of the book, and showed them how the various services worked and talked about what happened at Christmas, what happened a few days after Christmas on the day of the Holy Innocents, when the choir boys had a special day when they got to be in charge of the choir, and that they had what was called the boy bishop at churches, where one of the choir boys would dress up in little vestments and quote unquote preside over the services. And all of this wonderful stuff that happens just during the Christmas season. And I think that by looking at a book like this, it helps us understand the musical world that Tallis would have grown up in. And also, a book like this has all kinds of chant melodies that Tallis wound up setting to music. So much of his music, especially earlier in life when he was still writing for these Catholic services, so much of it was based on plain chant, was based on Gregorian chant. And you can find the melodies in this book. And you asked about differences between the Sarum and the Roman rites. That would be a whole nother podcast. But
Yes.
one interesting thing is that the melodies are slightly different. They come from a slightly different tradition. And if you look at this antiphonale, if you're familiar with singing chant, you see lots of melodies. You know them from singing Vespers, you know them from singing Compline, but they're just different enough to throw you off. In fact, a lot of the Sarum melodies and a lot of the ceremonies in general are quite similar to the Dominican rite. And I sing myself at a Dominican priory, so I recognize a lot of this stuff that comes up, a lot of these variants. And in a way, it makes me feel closer to these English musicians before the Reformation, because what they did back then is what has never changed in the Dominican rite. Of course, that they got grandfathered in at the Council of Trent. They didn't have to regularize everything because they'd been around so long. And the interesting thing is that if England hadn't gone Protestant, they would have got to keep the Sarum rite as well. That they would have gotten to keep their traditional rite, their traditional music.
Right.
So it's kind of a blast from the past singing through these books, and it's reminds me of some of the work I do now.
So thank you so much for explaining all these things to us, Kerry. It's so fascinating to understand the changes as they happened in the liturgy, and also how that really affected the musicians of the time. And I'm wondering if you could point our listeners to where they might find out more about your work, and where they might get your book.
Well, my book is just called Tallis. It's a very simple title. And so just put the composer's name in and you'll get the book. It's published with Oxford University Press, and you can order it directly from the publisher. The press has a very nice website, oup.com, and they have free shipping last time I looked, so you can get it from them. And another thing I'd love people to know about my book is that it comes with a website that has music.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, you can look right after the preface to the book. There's the URL for the website. And I've got 60 sound clips, so 60, so quite a few. And you can listen to, I think I've chosen some really beautiful performances. There's some amazing groups out there doing this early English music. And you can listen to all the music I talk about. And I start with chant. There's a whole section where you can listen to various pieces of chant. And then you start with Tallis's early works, and you kind of walk through his whole career by listening. So the website is highly recommended as well.
That's great. You know, it's such a challenge, you know, in producing this podcast, dealing with copyrights and stuff, that it often precludes us from including musical clips. But it's so important for people to go and listen to these things. You know, there's the kind of standard joke about some music departments in the U.S. where music is seen and not heard.
Right.
And really, you know, what your companion website seems to highlight is that, you know, we begin with the music, and that's the core of our experience.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of these historical changes that Tallis lived through, they make a lot more sense when you listen to the music, not just thinking about it in abstract theological terms, but actually hearing what people would have sung, hearing what people would have played. It makes a lot more sense. I know it does for me. I listened to so much music while I was writing this book. I wrote it with my ears almost as much as with my hands.
That's great. Thank you again so much, Kerry. This has been really interesting and informative.
Thanks for having me. It's been great talking with you.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast with Peter Carter and Dr. Jennifer Donaldson. For more information about this episode, sacred music resources, or upcoming events, visit our website at sacredmusicpodcast.com. You can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, SoundCloud, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoy our podcast, please write us a review on iTunes. This improves our iTunes ranking and helps others find out about the podcast. The music you heard at the beginning of this episode is Hec Dies by William Byrd, sung by the London Oratory's Schola Cantorum Boys Choir, directed by Charles Cole, from the CD Sacred Treasures of England. The music at the conclusion of this podcast is the first movement of Trio Sonata No. 6 in G major by Johann Sebastian Bach, performed by Peter Carter. We look forward to having you join us next time, and until then, may we sing the praise of His glory.